Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I'm going to show you how to do a multi-layer dye technique on a decorative platter. On this piece, I've already turned the back side of the platter, so we don't have to go over that, but if you need help with those, check out our YouTube channel for other platter turning videos. But we're going to start with this being turned and finished to where we can flip it around and go ahead and apply our multi-layer dye process to the rim of the piece. So this is ready to go into a chuck. I've already sized the recess for my chuck jaws. So I'm going to go ahead and get this mounted up. Make sure you tighten up both of those pinion gears to make sure everything's fully secure. But what we need to do from this stage of the process, where we already have the back complete, is we're going to go ahead and establish the rim of the platter. And because this is a decorative platter and I'm not going to be using it for storing any items, and it's not a utility piece, I'm going to go with an extra wide rim on here to really showcase the multi-layer dye process that we're going to do and show off the really good figure in the piece that we have. Before we start turning this, we want to talk about blank selection just a little bit. For the dye to look really, really good, it needs to be on some figured material where we have side grain and end grain, because that's going to absorb that dye a little bit differently because of the end grain and side grain, and that allows you to layer different colors of dye and add a lot of depth and dimension to the piece. So if you can get a piece, getting something really high figure like this isn't as easy as getting just plain material, but the results are really worth finding some good material to do this on. So now that I've got this in the chuck, I'm just going to double check, make sure everything's still snug. We can go ahead and establish our rim, get our tool rest set up, and throw on some dye. So for the decorative platter, I want this to be about 2/3 rim, 1/3 of the decorative dish in the center. So that's actually going to be fairly close to this mark from my screw center chuck. I'm going to go just a hair wider. So that's going to be our bowl in the center, and the rest of this is going to be a nice curved rim with color on it. As far as my overall thickness of the rim, I'm going to have to remove a fair amount of material here. I don't want to go ultra thin on the rim because the dye will bleed through and soak into the back if we don't seal that up, or if it's too thin, because those end grain fibers are running directly like this pen and it'll pull the dye through to the back side. So I don't want to go too thin on the rim, but that's something we'll address as we get a little bit further in. So I'm going to get my bowl gouge. Make sure you have your eye protection on. Get your dust collection going. Wear a dust mask when you're doing this. This piece of poplar that I'm turning, it's really dusty because it's obviously it's completely dry, but it's really dusty material to turn. But let's go ahead and start the lathe. We'll bring the speed up. Just make sure everything's running nice and true before we turn the speed all the way up. So right now I'm about 12 to 1300 RPM. I'm going to use my bowl gouge to give ourselves our rim that we need, but I'm not going to turn out the bowl just yet. So I've got my flute completely closed over, and we're just going to be scraping with the bottom wing here to true this up. This poplar is really pretty, but it's a very, very dusty timber, and it's really abrasive on the tools. So I'm going to be hitting the grinder quite frequently on this piece. It's very abrasive and just destroys the edge on your tools. I'm going to give myself just a little bit more tool rest to work with here. We're just stepping this down, getting our overall thickness, which I'm going to shoot for about 1/4 of an inch thick on the rim. That's going to be roughly where we want to end at. That way we can give ourselves a nice decorative band to tie the color in and give it a little bit of a border. I'm just dragging the tool across, pulling it towards me. I'm rotating my hips as I do that as well because I want this to be a nice gentle curve across the face. The reason I'm dragging this cut across, it is a scrape, but I'm cutting into side grain. If I roll the gouge over and cut towards the center, I'm cutting into end grain, so it'll wear my edge out really fast. So a good scrape on this will work really well. I can feel my edge is starting to go. But I'm going to keep reducing this down. I've got about a 1/4 inch left of material I need to remove. Yeah, I can feel my edge is gone already. I'm going to go hit the grinder. I'll be right back. Alright, so I just touched this up on the grinder. I can definitely feel that it's cutting a lot easier. I'm using a 1/2 inch bowl gouge. It's got a 5/8 bar. You could get away with a little bit smaller gouge, but the nice thing about this size of a gouge is I have 5/8, about 5/8 of an inch of wing to cut with. And I can vary where I'm cutting on. I can go from right at the tip, I can rotate the handle inward a little bit, start cutting on this wing, and just cut across that wing as it starts doling out. Gives you more surface area. But I talked about this a little bit before. This piece is completely dry. You don't want to dye wet wood. It doesn't take the dye well because there's water in the pores of the wood. And there's nowhere for that dye to really go and stay. And the other thing too is if you try to spray lacquer wet wood, it's going to have issues with the finish. So make sure your piece is about 7-8% moisture content or less if you can get it. Rotate my tool handle or my tool rest over just a little more. And I'm just squeezing my hand closed, and that's pulling the tool towards me, and it's nice and controllable on the very last bit of the cut. For the first half, I'm just dragging it across my rest. But once I get to about right here, then I'll squeeze my hand closed. And that gives me a nice controlled cut, especially right at the edge. So I'm going to stop the lathe and check our curve we have. That's got a nice radius to it. You don't want any flat spots when you're doing a decorative rim because the flat spots will pick up the light once you have your spray lacquer on there, and you'll notice all the little flat faceted areas. You want just a nice gentle curve, either from the rim in or just from a nice gentle curve on the outside. So you can see with a nice sharp tool we're getting a pretty clean cut considering how difficult this material is to work with. I think I'm going to thin out the rim just a hair, and then we'll do a shear scraping pass across the surface and we can start applying our dye. I adjusted the lathe speed up slightly. When you're going for a finishing cut, increasing your lathe speed will usually give you a better surface, as well as now I'm taking a lighter cut. You can see just a very, very small cut there. A little more controlled as far as my feed rate, which will leave a nice clean surface. If you try and go too fast, you're not going to have a very smooth surface. So be nice, slow, smooth, and controllable. Try and get rid of any of those tool marks you have on the surface. I'm just squeezing my hand closed. All right, let's look at our surface we have. So that is actually really clean. For poplar like this stuff tears out really, really easily and it's very soft. So that cut actually left us a very nice surface. You can really see that figure starting to pop now. I do need to clean up some tear out on the rim from when I roughed it down. So I'm gonna rotate my gouge over and shear scrape on this bottom wing here across this rim to clean that up. And then again, I'm gonna drop my handle and I'm cutting just on that bottom edge there. Because I'm cutting into end grain fibers, it might be a little grabby. So a shear scrape is nice because it's not aggressive and it's very controllable. And you can see we were getting a nice fine little ribbon off there. Let's take a look at that. It's definitely cutting it a lot cleaner than it was. I'll do one more pass on there because there's some deeper tear out just there. And there's a little bit more right over here. So I'm going to bump up my speed just a little bit more to shear scrape. I'm at 1600 RPM, and you can see right now on the front camera, the tool rest locking lever is getting in the way of my handle, and I don't want to have that interrupt the cut. So I'm going to go ahead and flip that over and get that out of the way. You can see that fine little ribbon though that we're getting off there. That's a good shear scrape and a slice. All right, let's stop the lathe and take a look here. Okay, so all the tear out in the end grain fibers is gone now. I just want to thin out the rim just a hair more. And now I'm going to go for a shear scraping cut instead of just more of a scrape. So I'm going to drop the handle down more and close the flute over a little bit. And you can see I'm going to catch some of the shavings here. We're getting those fine ribbons. That shear scrape is working very well. If you're one of the guys that loves the push cut, you could definitely come around here and then do a push cut to the rim, and then you could come around here and do a push cut to the center. So push cut, shear scrape, to me it doesn't really matter. Whatever you're more comfortable with and proficient with, do whatever you like better. I'm more of the Mahoney mindset where a shear scrape usually works better for me. That, and I can control that tool a lot better than I can with a push cut. But do whatever works for you best. So now that we have a nice gentle curve on our rim, we don't have any tear out, the rim here is nice and clean, I think we're about ready to apply some dye. I'm just going to give this one last inspection before we sand. Alright, so if I feel the curve from the inside to the exterior, I think I'm just a little bit high right around here. So I'm going to shear scrape this and try and reduce that just a hair before we start sanding. Get your tool rest as close as possible. That'll help support the tool even better, especially on a shear scrape where my cutting edge is about 2 inches off of the tool rest. As I was making that cut, I'm getting a really good slice there. But I was making the cut and then I was reducing the amount of tool pressure as soon as I didn't want to keep cutting anymore right here. That's the nice thing about a shear scrape, is it's not a self-feeding cut, so you can start and stop the cut whenever you want. And you can feather it out to where the other area that's already done. It's kind of hard to explain what the shear scrape feels like, but once you do it, you know when it's cutting really well and it's easy to control. So it gives you a really, really clean surface as well. But now we're ready to sand this and then we can throw some dye on. So I'm going to remove my tool rest. Just drop that down, move the banjo out of the way. All right, when I'm looking at this surface here, I think I can start sanding with 220 grit. I'll give that a try and see if it's working efficiently. If it's not cutting very well, I'll drop down to 180. But if I can avoid those 180 scratches in the surface, I'm gonna do that. So I'm gonna start with 220. And we'll wanna turn the lathe speed down as well. Anytime you're sanding, you wanna drop your lathe speed. So that's about 700 RPM. If you're going too fast, it's going to heat up the material and you might heat check it, as well as it'll ruin the abrasive and the disc holder, and you can also, the sanding paper just doesn't cut efficiently. So I've got my drill in a trailing position. Reason you have it in a trailing position is so it doesn't grab and throw the disc down. If I try and sand from the top edge, it's going to kick my drill out of the way. So I've got it down in a sanding on the trailing edge of the disc. I'll give that a few passes and just see how the surface is reacting. So that 220 is abrading the surface and refining it. I think we'll be able to continue using the 220. I think 180 will be just a little bit too coarse. I've got a really good surface to start with. So whenever you're sanding, always start sanding based on the surface you leave from the tool. If you can leave a really clean cut, usually you can start with 220 or even 320. But if you have a rough surface, then you'll want to drop down to the 180 or the 120. But because I have a curve on here, I want to go ahead and just feather that curve as well. I don't want to spend too long in any one particular spot. That will leave flat areas on the surface. So you want to move that disc holder in a nice smooth manner to where this has a nice smooth radius as well. It's getting just a little grabby right in there at the rim. I'm just feeling the curve to see if there's any tool mark ridges. There's not. I'm going to go ahead and sand the rim. Same thing, trailing position. You want to be really careful when you're sanding here as well. A lot of times if the disc holder grabs, you might nick the back side of the piece that you've already finished. So you want to be really careful where you're sanding on the back side of that rim. Obviously you want to wear dust protection whenever you're doing this. Run your dust collector. I don't, just so we can pick up audio. But anytime I'm sanding, I'm always wearing a dust mask. One thing to note as far as the rim goes is I want this to be a really crisp transition from the outside of the rim to the face of this piece. So when I'm sanding, I'm not rolling that sanding disc over the rim and softening that curve. I want that to be a nice crisp edge like I've got on the back here. So as I'm sanding, I don't go past the edge of the rim and make sure I keep the nice crisp details. All right, I think we're ready to go on to 320. Take a look at the surface, stop the lathe. Make sure you don't have any tear out, any tool marks. All you want to see right now are the scratches from the 220 grit. If there's any tear out or anything, as soon as we put dye on it, it's going to make it stand out like a sore thumb. So always, especially on decorative pieces like this where we're doing a high gloss finish, you have to spend time making sure you have a properly finished surface. I'm going to go to 320 now. Make sure your paper's nice and centered up as well. A lot of times if the paper's off center, it'll flip the disc off and it'll melt those fibers because you'll run the drill right into your surface, as well as it'll leave a bunch of black plastic marks in the wood. So be careful that way. A lot of people ask me when I'm power sanding with a drill like this, where these are fairly expensive, why I use this versus an angle drill. This one has enough reach to where I can sand inside of bowls, and it's fairly comfortable. Plus, I have a bunch of batteries for this stuff. However, I do blow this thing out anytime I do power sand, just to help maintain the internals of the drill. So make sure you clean those out regularly when you're sanding. So as I'm power sanding, the edge of the disc holder caught that inside of the rim and caused it to catch in a little bit, but that's no problem. All right, we'll flip that over and sand the rim now. Again, we want to maintain the crisp detail right here on that corner. Let's take a look at our surface. So now we shouldn't really see any sanding scratches. The 320 scratches are almost non-existent, but we want to make sure we've sanded out all of the 220 grit scratches, and that looks pretty good. I'd say there might be a little bit of scratches, barely. All right, so I'm gonna go to 400 from the 320. And then we'll sand with 600 to finish. For me, once I start getting into the really fine sandpapers, the Abernet discs are really nice because normally those 400 and 600 grit discs clog up super fast. So I really like the net or the screen type abrasives. Now I'm going to drop to go to the 600. All right, let's stop the lathe and take a look. Yeah, that's really nice. So we don't have any scratches from our previous grits. There's no tear out. There's a tiny little bark inclusion there, but that's fine. Give that a good inspection before you move on, because right now this is what's going to set the foundation for a really nice clean surface when we're done. So make sure you put the effort in and have no scratches or tear out on the piece before we put dye on. Before we put our first coat of dye on, I want to spray this with denatured alcohol to raise the grain that we can sand back and give ourselves a good surface. Otherwise, we'd put our dye layer on, and then from there, after you cut it back, you might have some areas that would have raised grain that you'd spray lacquer over and would leave a rough surface. So if we want to prevent that, go ahead and just give ourselves the best possible surface to start. And I'm making sure to hit the rim as well, because we will sand that again. But you can see when you spray that with alcohol, all that figure really starts to pop, and that's what's going to emphasize the color and dye we put on. But just give that a good saturated coat of DNA. That's going to raise those wood fibers. They're going to swell up, and then we can sand them back and leave a really clean surface. I'll turn the lathe on and just let that air dry really quick. Fortunately, the alcohol dries really fast. You could definitely raise the grain with water and a towel. The only downside is it takes a lot longer for it to dry out before you can start putting out the dye on. So DNA is the fastest way to do it, but I can feel the little fuzzy raised areas of the grain, so I'm going to hit that again with 600. Okay. That surface looks very, very nice, and it's extremely smooth now. So I'm going to get a clean paper towel, just wipe it off, prep the surface for our dye. I'm going to put on some gloves as well. The dye we're going to be using stains skin extremely well as wood, so always wear some gloves. But this is just a clean paper towel, just wiping any dust or debris we might have on here. And you can see all the dust on the paper towel, so just getting rid of that. Wipe off the backside too, just to prevent any dust. All right, so I've got my dyes out. These are the Artisan dye. These are a shellac-based, alcohol-based with shellac dye. These are color fast and they're extremely vivid colors. But I want to talk about a little bit about color theory on this piece. Whenever you're dyeing a piece, you want to take into account the base color. So this is pretty white, pretty blonde. It does have some amber color to it. So I'm going to go with something to where we can emphasize these lighter browns. So we're going to start out with a really dark blue base, which will be pulled into the end grain fibers. Then we'll sand through that, and then we'll put on a green layer, do a light sand again, and then put on a yellow. That's going to allow us to do a multi-layer dye process and have all the end grain be nice and really dark blue, but where the side grain is, it's going to be a nice lighter blue with a green and yellow tone to it. So this is a good base to start out with. You always want to go with your darkest color first, and then go to your next lightest, and then the lightest after that. But you could definitely go with a red base and then cut it back into orange and yellow. You could start out with purple, do a lighter blue teal, and then a little bit of yellow on some of the color or some of the figure to emphasize it. But there's a ton of examples online as far as different color theory and which color works best for you. And if you need a little color wheel as well, that might help you out. So I'm going to start out with the blue. Remove the little safety seal. And this dye will stain every surface it touches. So you want to be extremely careful as far as keeping the cap on. I like the sampler pack, these little smaller bottles. It's a lot easier to apply than the really big ones. But whatever the dye touches, it will stain, including your lathe, your clothes, and the floor. So be very careful. As far as application goes, I'm going to get a paper towel and just wad this up to where I have a nice, fairly firm pad here, and I'm going to saturate that with the dye. Make sure you shake this up because that shellac does settle. So you want to make sure that's shaken up very nice, and then saturate this pad really well. Once we start applying it, we don't want to have this stop and sit anywhere for too long. So you want to do just nice brush strokes. Whatever you do, do not spray the dye directly onto the piece with the bottle because it's so concentrated, it'll darken those areas more than when you start wiping it on. You'll have little smudgy areas. So I recommend just apply it with a rag. Keep that rag moving, and then just do multiple layers of dye. Make sure you have a nice solid work surface to put your bottles on. We were at a AAW symposium once, and we dropped a couple bottles of dye on the floor that stained the expo hall really, really well, and they weren't very happy about it. So be careful with where you have your dye, because this stuff does stain extremely bad. Try and keep the dye off the rim here. I will have to touch this up just a little bit because I want this to be a nice crisp detail after I do all the dyeing. So try and keep it off there, and then definitely don't get it on the back side of the piece because I don't want dye on the back. What we're looking for though right now is just a uniform coverage of dye. Making sure that there's no light areas and that it's a uniform layer. I can see there's some light areas here and here. Probably need to do another coat here, but I want that dark blue to saturate the end grain fibers. And the end grain is going to pull the dye in a lot farther than the side grain, and that's what will allow us to get that multi-layered dye. But you can see that figure really starting to pop now with that blue on there. Once you think you have good coverage, go ahead and inspect the surface. I would say I need a little bit more dye right here and right here. But otherwise it's looking pretty good. Okay, now I'm just going to turn this on and let that air dry really fast. And we're done with our blue dye for now, so I can go ahead and put that away into my tray. The next color we're going to go with is going to be the green. But right now I want to sand back just a little bit of the surface area and expose some of the side grain fibers, because the dye isn't going to penetrate as deep in the side grain. We're going to expose some fresh material that we can then hit with the green. So I'll take my 600 grit off. I'm going to go back to the 400. I'm using the screen on this one because the shellac base in here will clog up your regular paper really, really fast. So for cutting back dye, go with the sanding screens. That'll be a lot better for you. And we just want to do a light pass with our grit. But you can see, if I stop this and take it off, you can see that shellac gets all shiny on there and clogs up the paper. So just wrinkle it around, it'll break up all that shellac. Our lathe speed is still low, which is what we want. But you can see it's starting to lighten up here where we're sanding through the dye, and you can see it clogging up the paper again. And you can see the disc holder's nice and blue now. Just clean that off. You can see all the dye dust right there. Again, same thing. Stop the lathe and see if we're sanding through enough. Yeah, you can see the side graining exposing the natural wood color. Might need to sand just a little more. Clean out the paper. If your paper is not sanding through fast enough for you, you can always drop back down to 320. That's looking pretty good though. We have the nice light areas. That'll take the green color very, very well, and that'll give us a nice multicolor. I'm going to sand just a hair more on the rim here. I don't want to remove too much of the blue though, because I do want the majority of this color to be the blue. But I think we're about where we want to be. Okay, so we have our really dark areas. That's all end grain, right there and there and there. Anywhere that's light color, that's our side grain. So I'm going to get a rag and we're going to feather those areas with the green, and that'll give us a really pretty look. Because I'm going to be trying to do a more detailed application, I'm just going to roll this over a little bit into a cone shape so I can go in there and feather that. Make sure you shake up your dye bottle really well, and then we'll saturate this. Just a little bit more of the green on the rag because it dries really quick with the alcohol base. But right now I'm just trying to accentuate the figure and give ourselves some depth with our color base. The nice thing with the shellac is it does help set up and kind of set the dye in place. so it doesn't just run out when you touch it with alcohol again. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now that we have our green on, I'm going to get a nice clean section of rag. Take our yellow. Make sure it's shaken up really well. I'm going to turn the lathe on this time, and I'll saturate the entire pad with yellow. And I'm going to spray the surface with some DNA and then give ourselves a nice blend wash to help blend the blue and that green together. Now I'm going to get a clean section of rag. I know we're going kind of fast here. Clean section of rag with just DNA to help blend those colors. And this will give us a really pretty teal color now, with the very dark blue areas in the end grain. And that looks pretty sharp. You can see how we've accentuated all the side grain figure with the green and the yellow. I'm really liking that though. I'm gonna hit it one more time with just DNA. If you have any issues with the colors contrasting too much where you put the green on, you can always feather them out with alcohol. Just give it a little spray on a rag and then you can kind of blend them together. But I think we're about there. So now that we've got all of our dye on there, you can see the green and yellow areas on the side grain, and then those nice really dark lines going through on the end grain. So it gives you a lot more depth to the piece and really makes that color pop. So I'm happy with the application we have on the dye. I just need to shear scrape the rim one more time to give us a clean surface for our marker, and then we can turn the bowl out and sand and finish and throw our lacquer on. One thing to note with your dye rags, because these are flammable, make sure you flatten them out and go put them outside on the ground or hang them over a trash can, something to let these dry out before you throw them away. Just a little safety shop tip there. So I need to shear scrape the rim because I had a little bit of dye bleed over. I'll sand that. I think that'll sand out just fine. On the rim, I'm going to drop back to my 320 and see if that'll sand out. I might need to shear scrape it though. The reason I want that nice and crisp is because we will be using a black marker to outline and give ourselves a rim or a frame here, a nice little border to define our color boundary from the natural wood. It just makes it look a lot nicer. So the rim is nice and cleaned up there. Now we can go ahead and turn out our bowl shape. Go ahead and set up your tool rest, standard working height with our 5/8 gouge. I'm just a touch low there. I'm going to take my gloves off, and I can reuse these later, so I'm going to put these aside. But if you have any questions as far as the process goes, go ahead and leave them in the comments. I directly answer those comments on there, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Also, if you have any video ideas or projects you want to see me turn, go ahead and leave that in the comments as well. But now we're ready to turn. I'm going to use my same bowl gouge here. Go ahead and hollow this out, give us our nice little bowl shape, and then we'll put a small chamfer in there to help give us our nice border as well. So one thing I want to make sure, I want to just double check my chuck tightness. Now that this has been in the chuck for so long, just make sure everything's still snug. As I'm turning this bowl out, I'm going to have to be extra diligent in making sure that my flute is closed when I start the cut, because right now I don't want to have my tool skate back and tear out the surface. We just dyed and pretty much have finished. So we're at the point now we don't want to have any catches or skates on us. So turn your lathe on and bring your turning speed back up. Right now we're at about 1400 RPM. That's what we turn the face with. But I'm just truing off the surface. I want to make sure that this is nice and true before I try to flip this over and ride the bevel in. A lot of times if that's bouncing, the tool will skate on you as well. But we're just going to use our bowl gouge to hollow this out, making sure my flute is closed before I start. Close the flute. Once I'm on bevel, I can open that to a 45 and then swing the handle, and then I raise it as I get that cutting edge to center as well. Make sure I'm closed on the bevel. Open it up and then arc it through. Just scraping that down so I don't have a small rim of material there that I could trip or get my tool to skate on. And then also I need to remove my revolving center to give myself clearance for my tool handle. A lot of times this tool rest is kind of in the way of my cut, but because of equipment and everything, it's just kind of, I can't really take it off, if that's why you're wondering sometimes. Alright, now that we're really close to our border of our finished surface, make sure that tool is closed over and anchor it so it doesn't skate on you. Alright, now I'm making sure my flute's completely closed because now I'm right at the edge of the color. And because this is such a tight radius, the bevel length on this is getting in the way and I'm getting a lot of tool rubbing there. So I'm going to switch over to a smaller gouge. This is my 1/4 inch bowl gouge. This has a lot shorter bevel so I can make that corner without putting too much bevel pressure on. Also, I'm going to get this just a little bit closer now because the tool is a lot smaller. It'll shatter on me. And I'm just trying to float that bevel. I don't want to put a lot of pressure on it. Use that smaller gouge, take smaller cuts. Basically what I'm trying to do is just float the bevel to where the wood doesn't know it's there, but it still has the control and support that I need. If you get too much bevel pressure, you compress those wood fibers, especially on a piece of wood that's as soft as poplar. It'll compress those fibers and it'll start to cause a little bit of a chatter and a wave to it. So I'm going to start and pick up the cut right here. And get that curve nice and smooth. You can see there are compression marks from the tool. So now that I've got my nice curve that I want on the inside, I'll do a couple final passes to try and clean that up. Make sure you're not going to bump into anything that's going to block you in your sweep. That way you can be as smooth as possible. I'm just floating that bevel. Nice arcing curve. And that's what we're looking for, just a nice smooth curve. I've got a really good radius on the inside, almost a semi-sphere. There are some tool marks on this outer edge, but I think that's just kind of what we're going to deal with this piece. We definitely have tear out here in the bottom where I'm catching some end grain. So I'm going to go to the grinder, touch this up, and see if we can do one more pass to really clean that surface. Alright, so I just hit up the grinder. I've got a really sharp, fresh edge on here. I'm going to make one more pass and try and smooth this out as best as possible. I want to reduce that tear out. You can see there I slipped off the bevel just a little bit and there's that ridge. I'm going to pick up the cut there again. And now you're cutting into end grains, so I'm going to take it nice and slow. Do that one more time. I want to be a little bit smoother. All right, let's see if we got rid of that tear out. There's still a little bit in the bottom, but it refined that a lot better, and we've got a really smooth curve. So let's go ahead and sand that now. But you can see kind of our idea behind the 2/3, 1/3 for the golden rule here as far as our design and shape. Because this is a decorative platter, I'm not worried about the weight or thickness of the piece. I just want to have a nice flowing curve on the exterior. I'll get that false rim there, and then we're going to have a nice, pretty decorative rim here with the color on it. So I'm going to start with the 220 grit again. We'll turn the lathe on. We'll drop our speed back down to about 700. And just try and feather that curve to smooth it out. This poplar's is really dusty. It's kind of nasty to work with, honestly. I really don't like turning poplar. It tears out extremely easy, and it's really dusty. But just looking at my surface, there's just a tiny bit of tear out right here still, and right here on the rim. Otherwise, it's working pretty well. The Woodturners dust mask is just holding your breath while you're sanding. Let's see what we've got here. All right, so if I rotate this around, I've got a little bit of tear out right here, which I might spot sand. But other than that, the surface is looking really good. I'm actually going to switch paper to a new piece of 220. This one I can feel the grit's just really not working very well. And usually you can tell when your sandpaper grit's just not cutting efficiently anymore. And that's when it's time to switch to a new disc. That's going to be all that needs to get rid of that. Okay, let's go on to the 320. Then we'll go on to our 400. Make sure you use a new piece of 400, not the one that we sanded the dye with, because this has a bunch of dye still in the pad, and that'll discolor the natural wood there. So make sure you get a new disc. All right, let's inspect our surface here. Actually, I'm gonna get rid of all the dust. All right, so we've got a really nice surface with the dye on it. Our bowl shape in the center has got a nice curve to it. There's no flat spots that I can see. You want to make sure you have a nice flowing curve to it, because once we put our spray lacquer on, it'll make those flat areas stand out. There's no torn grain or anything or scratch marks left, so I think we're ready for our spray lacquer. Oh, actually, we need to cut our small chamfer for our marker, and we're also going to marker the outside. I'm gonna bring my tool rest up. What I'm doing here is I'll use my skew to give myself a small chamfer right here on the rim. That's gonna allow me to take my marker and use the flat spot on the marker to give us a nice border between the natural wood and the dyed surface. And then we'll also use marker on the exterior of the rim. That's really gonna give us a border between the two materials, or the dye and the natural wood. And it just looks really sharp. So when I'm cutting this chamfer, I do want to increase the speed because I'm not sanding the chamfer. I want to have a nice crisp detail line. So I'm going to bump the speed up to about 1600 RPM. We were turning at 1400, but with this tool and what I want to do with it, I want to have a really, really clean cut on this surface. So once you set your skew up, just give it an angle to where you're going to have a nice little 45-degree chamfer on that surface, and go ahead and make the cut. And that's all that chamfer needs to be. You could go wider or thinner if you want, but this is going to give us a really good surface for our marker. So this is just a Tombow marker. It's got two ends on it. This is more of a writing tip, and then this is a really fine felt tip on this end. And to apply it, I'll drop my lathe speed down to about 400 RPM, and I'll use a tool rest as my anchor for my marker. I don't want to freehand hold it while I'm trying to do this. So make sure you're anchored on the tool rest, and then I'm going to use the flat wing of the marker tip to color that chamfer. Rotate the marker a little bit in your hand to give yourself a fresh edge of the marker. And then just keep that on there until you have a nice solid black line. And you can see if I move that out of the way, you can see that's given us a really good boundary between the two colors here. So we've got a really pretty natural interior and then our dyed rim. We've got a really good transition between the two with that frame. Now we'll do the exact same thing to the exterior rim. And this one will take a little bit longer to do just because of the surface area. I think this marker's dead too. All right, so my marker's actually just run out of ink. I've been using this thing for a long time. I'm gonna go get a new marker, and I'll be right back. All right, so I got a fresh marker. I know somebody's gonna ask, can you use a Sharpie to do the same thing? Yes, you can, but it's not light fast like the Tombows are. As these Sharpies fade, they go purple over time, so I would stay away from using a Sharpie. But yes, you could use a Sharpie if push came to shove. But just rotating the marker tip around to fully saturate the edge. I'm actually going to drop that speed down just a touch. Let's take a look at the rim. There's a couple spots where we need some more ink. And you can also try using the other end of the pen if you need to. Fortunately, because I spray lacquered the back side of this piece, the marker wipes off really well because I just bumped into the back side of the piece with the marker. But it wipes off because that spray lacquer doesn't stick to. Okay, but that rim's getting nice and dark now. You can see we're getting good saturation with the marker. And I think we're about there. So I'm really happy with the interior border. That's nice and saturated. The exterior looks really good, and it gives us that nice visual definition and separation of color to natural wood. But let's stop the lathe and take a look and just make sure we have complete marker saturation here. I think that looks pretty good. I think we're ready for our spray lacquer finish. I'm going to turn this on and give the piece a once over with a clean rag. I turned my lathe speed back up. I'm going to move my tool rest and the banjo completely out of the way. And then just wipe down the surface. I recommend starting on the natural wood first just in case, that way you don't carry dye or marker if it's not completely set up into the natural material. But I would say that surface is ready for our spray lacquer now. As far as finish goes, I recommend a spray lacquer. The reason being is it'll set the dye and it won't carry it across the surface. If I use any other finish where I'm actually contacting it with a rag, it's going to pull dye and it's going to leach it out as well on the marker band. It'll pull some of that black into our color and we don't want that. So spray lacquer is a good, very good option for it. The other nice thing too is it gives you a lot more gloss than most of your wipe-on finishes. But there's a couple tips whenever you're using a spray lacquer. You want this to be nice and warm, like 70, 80 plus degrees as far as the can goes. When it's really cold, it doesn't spray out very smooth. And that'll lead you to more time later trying to polish that out. So we want this to spray as smooth as possible, so you want to shake it up really well and make sure this is nice and warm. A lot of times I'll usually soak these in a pot of hot water, 90, 100 degree water. Just get that nice and fluid so it'll spray really well. Alright, so the can has been shaken up really well. It's nice and warm, ready to spray out. As far as spraying goes, the first coat I want to be fairly light. I don't want to go really heavy on the coat. I want just a nice dusting to where the subsequent coats will tack to it really well. If you go too heavy on your first coat, you're going to get runs and you're going to have to sand through that all. So avoid spraying too heavy as much as possible. Obviously, you really want to wear a dust mask, preferably one with a charcoal filter whenever using spray lacquer. Best thing to do, take it outside, spray it outside with a mask on. In the studio, it's pretty small in here, so we're going to open up the door after I do a few coats and let it dry out. But make sure you wear some good dust mask when you're doing this. So as far as my passes go, I'm going to just go left to right as smooth and consistently as possible and give ourselves a nice base coat to tack to. I always usually test the spray, make sure it's spraying out good before I put it on my piece. The other thing too is you could cover your lathe if you need to. The nice thing about the spray lacquer is it's a clear finish, so it doesn't darken or discolor the piece. It just amplifies those natural colors and figure that we have. But as I rotate the piece, now that it's got some lacquer on it, you should see the figure really starting to accentuate the chatoyancy we have, as well as making those colors more and more vivid. Also, you want to make sure you get lacquer down in the natural area. So rotate that over. And then I want to hit the rim. But you can see it also darkens up that marker really well and makes everything just more vivid. Gives it that nice wet look to it. But now that I have a coat on here, I'll let this dry for about 20-30 minutes. I'm going to go step outside so I don't die of the fumes, and we'll let this cure up nice and ready for our next coat. Alright, so our first coat is fully cured. We're going to go ahead and apply 2 to 3 more coats with the same process. And after your last coat, we're going to want to let this cure for about 24 to 48 hours before we cut through it and polish it out. So for my second coat, same technique as before. This time I can go a little bit heavier on the coat. However, I still want to make sure that it's light enough that I won't have runs through it. But we're just trying to build up the lacquer because we want to be able to buff it out and cut through and polish the lacquer once we're done. And that'll give us a lot smoother surface. The spray lacquer, straight from the can, tends to leave a little bit of an orange peel texture, a little bit rough, so we want to be able to polish that at the very end. But usually I try to shoot for 2 to 3 coats, sometimes 4, depending on how porous the surface is. Make sure to get that exterior rim as well. It never hurts to cover your chuck with a bag or anything like that. You'll just make sure you want to take that off before you turn the lathe on. I'm not too concerned about overspray on this. It's getting pretty much just on the surface where I want it. But I think I'll let this cure. I'll apply one more coat, final coat, and then I'll let that cure for 48 hours. And then I'll show you guys how to cut through and polish your spray lacquer. And then this piece will be ready to go. So let's give this some time to cure, and we'll be back. All right, so I've let the piece cure over the weekend for about 3 days at 70 degrees or so to let this finish fully cured and harden up so we can go ahead and cut through it and polish it back. At this point, you could leave it if you wanted to be done here, but the surface isn't as smooth as I'd like, and we can bump up the shine and increase that gloss a little bit by polishing the spray lacquer that we put on so far. So from this point, I'm going to sand the surface with, this is a Merlon, this is a soft sponge pad basically with 1,000 grit abrasive on it, and we're going to lightly sand the surface just to scuff it up a little bit. And then we'll use scratch free and then the Micro Magic to polish the spray lacquer. I wouldn't go any coarser than 1,000 grit. And if you wanted to, you could start with a little bit finer at like the 2,000 grit version. But the nice thing is, because this is so soft, it's not going to leave any indentations or anything from the grit because the pad is really, really soft and spongy. The other nice thing too with these is you can wet sand, but I wouldn't wet sand on a piece like this. So. One thing I want to check as well, because I've let this sit in the chuck over the weekend, I just want to make sure my chuck is nice and secure still and the piece is in there and that it hasn't shifted at all. Then we'll throw on our safety glasses just in case. And because we are going to be power sanding and the lathe is spinning, I'll have the speed fairly low. I don't want to be too aggressive on the surface because I don't want to sand completely through the lacquer layer we have. I just want to lightly abrade the surface and try and refine it. So about 500 RPM. And I'm going to gently kiss the pad onto the surface. And just back and forth in a smooth motion just to get rid of those little high bumpy areas. Sand the rim as well. And it doesn't take much to knock those bumpy parts off of there from the spray. All right, you can feel that last coat of lacquer leaves these little tiny high spots on the finish, and they're kind of bumpy, but that 1,000 grit will knock all those down and allow us to start buffing it out. The other thing too is we will buff out the back side here because I had some overspray. But let's stop the lathe and you can see the surface. See now it's kind of a satin sheen to it. We've knocked those high points down. From here to here looks pretty good. I think there are still some bumpy areas I want to sand out just right here on this last inch of the rim. But this process is the reason why we put 3 to 4 coats of lacquer on. We want to have enough lacquer there we can sand through it and polish it. You don't want to put one coat on and then try and sand it back, or else you're going to go through the finish and then you're going to be sanding into the wood fibers, and then you're going to have to redo the dye and the lacquer application. So now that we have a nice satin sheen across the piece, let's go ahead and get our scratch free, and we'll turn up our lathe speed to our turning speed about 1500 RPM. All right, I've got my scratch free. I'm going to apply it on the rag and then just start working it into the surface. And all we're trying to do is refine the spray lacquer so that it's more optically clear, giving us higher gloss, and it allows that dye and the colored surface to really pop when it's exposed to some good light. I'm also going to sand the back of the platter, or not sand it, I'm just going to use some of the polishing paste on the back of the platter to remove any of that overspray we had. I have some shavings in my scratch free that I dropped in there. I don't want to scratch that surface, so I'm going to make sure to remove those. Alright, now I'll get a clean piece of paper towel and buff off the scratch free so we can go on to our finer grits. It's a self-ejecting paper towel. As soon as it gets loaded up with wax, it shoots it off so you can get a new one. But I can see, if I hold my hand up against the piece, I can see the reflection of my hand in the spray lacquer, so I know I'm increasing my shine. That's going to be one of the cool things, is as we go through the process, you'll see that shine just building up and up as we go through it. Those paper towels, dude. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. I can see the reflection of the paper towel really well. Now I'm going to go on to the Micro Magic. There's the white, the blue, and the red. So I start out with number 1, which is the red tin. And this has some microcrystalline in it, so it will be fairly sticky when I put it on the piece, and it'll probably try to pull the paper towel out of your hand. So make sure you have a decent grip on it. The other thing too is I don't want to put a lot of pressure on the piece as I'm polishing it. Reason being is with polishing compounds you can easily overheat the lacquer and then it'll smear on you and it'll ruin the surface and you'll have to sand it back. So you got to be very careful when you're polishing this. You can't polish it like a normal plastic. It is acrylic and it is fairly soft, comparably speaking. So don't overwork the surface and don't sit in any one spot for too long. Just going to get a little bit more. Alright, I'll get a clean section of rag, buff off that grit. Reason you go to a clean section of rag between grits is so you can remove that coarser particle before you put on a finer polish. Otherwise the coarser particles will contaminate the surface when you're trying to go finer and finer. You can see that shine getting glossier and glossier, the reflection off of the piece as we're polishing this out. Again, don't overwork the surface. You don't want it to get hot. If it's feeling, obviously use your fingers as a temperature gauge. If the surface, when you're pushing against it, if it's starting to get hot and generate that friction, you're putting too much pressure on. You want just enough to melt the wax and allow it to do the polishing for you, but you don't want to overheat that lacquer. Don't forget the rim and the back side if you have any overspray. Alright, I'm pretty happy with the gloss we have there. Let's go ahead and buff this out with a clean paper towel now. Just to remove any of the surface wax. And then we can stop the lathe and see just what kind of finish we have behind. And see if there's anywhere that we need to polish more or if it's okay. Alright, let's stop the lathe and take a look. All right, so that looks really good. We've got a really high gloss. I'm actually going to take this out of the chuck now so we can show it off to you. But that is a good surface. So we've got a nice high gloss, we've got a high gloss match on the back, and then that dyed platter, nice little decorative platter, is pretty much done. So in this video we basically went over basic application of dyes, how to finish it, and some of the tips and techniques, but there's so much more to coloring and different surface techniques and layers and stuff that you can do. So please, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll answer them directly myself. But yeah, go ahead and get out to the lathe and have some fun. It's a really fun project, and the dyes add a lot of creativity to the piece. So thanks, guys.